Good morning. My name is Victor Boleg, and I'm the president-elect of the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. Thank you for joining us today for this important program on housing insecurity, co-sponsored by the League and our friends and partners at the NAACP Tucson branch. We respectfully acknowledge that the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson is on land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the Tohono and the Paskayaki people. We also humbly acknowledge that for most of its history, our organization has not been welcoming to women of color. To quote our CEO of the League of Women Voters of the US, Virginia Casey Solomon, even during the civil rights movement, the League was not as present as we should have been, while activists risked life and limb to register Black voters in the South. The League's work and our leaders were late in joining to help protect all voters at the polls. It wasn't until 1966 that we reached our first position to combat discrimination. Still, our focus on social policy was from afar, not on the front lines, and African Americans were shut out of the vision of the League. Today, we invite all peoples, regardless of gender, gender identity, ability, ethnicity, or race, to join us as we commit to righting the wrongs of our past and building a stronger, more inclusive democracy. The League of Women Voters is an all-volunteer, nonpartisan organization. We do not support or oppose political parties or candidates at any level of government. Our mission is to empower voters and encourage active, informed participation in government. We envision a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate, and where eligible citizens are registered and informed on all candidates and issues, and votes. Towards that end, since 1920, the League has provided education and advocacy on the issues of the day. And now I'd like to hand it over to Cherie Meeks, president of the NAACP.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Cherie Meeks, and I serve as the president of NAACP Tucson branch, and I'm so grateful for this amazing collaboration with the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. The mission of the NAACP is to achieve equity, political rights, and social inclusion by advancing policies and practices that expand human and civil rights, eliminate discrimination, and accelerate the well-being, education, and economic security of Black people and all persons of color. The Tucson Branch Housing Committee addresses housing issues in our community and works to eliminate race-based discrimination in housing. We also work to ensure equity in and access to affordable housing. Providing information to our community is an ongoing critical component of our advocacy, and that is what we are here to do today. Housing is an issue that impacts our community in various ways, and we look forward to your engagement with today's webinar. Thank you so much for being here.
I am Maura Raffensperger and will be your moderator this morning. I'm assisted behind the scenes by Barbara Becker, who will sort your questions, Sue DeArmond as timer, and Dee Maitland as our backup moderator. Jeremy Brittle is our Zoom tech guru. Additional thanks to Bob Delaney of the NAACP for organizing the panel, and Barbara Norander and Judy Wood for coordinating this event. Housing insecurity. There are few things as important as housing: stable, safe, adequate housing. And yet more and more people are without housing, at least for some part of their lives. People living on the edge may cycle in and out of housing several times in a year. We are fortunate to have 4 very knowledgeable speakers on our panel today to help us understand both the challenges and some solutions for our housing insecurity crisis. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping points. For continuity, the question and answer segment will follow the final panelist. So let's get started by introducing our panelists. First up will be Jay Young. Jay, the executive director of the Southwest Fair Housing Council, is a passionate civil rights advocate. Currently, he serves on the City of Tucson Planning Commission, the City of Tucson Commission on Equitable Housing and Development, the Southern Arizona Prosperity Alliance, and the National Fair Housing Alliance Board. Jay holds a BA in History from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was a Peace Corps Fellow at the University of Arizona, where he earned an MS in Planning. Jim Tofel will be next. Jim is Managing Director with Tofel Dent Construction and has over 150 multifamily projects to his credit. Jim's passion for providing housing opportunities for those less fortunate has propelled Tofel Dent Construction to being one of the leading affordable housing general contractors in Arizona and New Mexico. With Jim's leadership in large multifamily project categories, including high-density market rate, senior living, and mixed-use projects, Tofel Dent Construction is proud to have completed many successful projects. Tom Lewicki will follow Jim. Tom has served in the human services field since 1990, with the last 15 years of service to persons experiencing homelessness in Tucson. Tom has a master's degree in counseling and human relations from Northern Arizona University and is a licensed independent substance abuse counselor. He currently serves as CEO for Old Pueblo Community Services, a not-for-profit community agency that provides evidence-based housing and support services to persons experiencing homelessness. Tom also serves the community as a commissioner on the Pima County Regional Affordable Housing Commission and as a member of the Southwest Interdisciplinary Research Center Community Advisory Board of the ASU Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. Our final panelist, Gerald Williams, adds his lived experience to our discussion today. Gerald is a formerly incarcerated individual who has experienced homelessness here in Pima County. He currently works at Emerge as a men's education program facilitator. He also facilitates a group called HEAT for African American men ages 18 to 40 and is looking to bring HEAT for youth here as well for ages 13 to 18. Gerald works with several organizations within the community, including the NAACP and the IMA, the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance. He is an active member of Rising Star Baptist Church and a father of 6. Jay, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me this morning. My name is Jay Young. Again, I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Fair Housing Council. And what I'm going to do today in my 15 minutes is I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do at the Southwest Fair Housing Council. And then I'm going to provide some history and context about housing segregation and how we segregated people by race and ethnicity in this country and how that continues to show up in our housing patterns today and in terms of who has access to opportunity in our communities. So with that, at the Southwest Fair Housing Council, we're a statewide agency, so we serve all of Arizona. And the core of what we do is we provide enforcement services for folks who have experienced illegal housing discrimination. So people contact us and we help them to exercise their fair housing rights. And that can end up in a complaint with the federal government or sometimes lawsuits in federal court. We also do education and outreach that consists of trainings about the Fair Housing Act, fair housing rights, et cetera. And we attend events and do media activities as well, really anything that we can do to get the word out about fair housing. And then we also advocate for what is called affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is also part of the Fair Housing Act that many people don't know about. But the idea is that the Fair Housing Act says that we have an obligation legally under the Fair Housing Act to undo segregated housing patterns and create integrated communities of opportunity. So with that, I start my presentation really by talking about housing segregation and the fact that it's not a choice and that we created a framework and a system in this country to segregate people by race and ethnicity on purpose and very intentionally. So I start with the Great Migration over 100 years ago. And the reason I do that is because during the Great Migration, Black Americans fled really the apartheid in the South, fleeing racial violence to cities in the Midwest and the North and the West. And when African Americans left the South en masse, typically they moved into neighborhoods in these cities that were not highly segregated, often less than 30% Black. Over time, though, there were zoning codes that were adopted that separated people by race, though they were later found unconstitutional. Real estate agents throughout much of the 20th century had a code of ethics that basically said in order to be a realtor, you needed to pledge to keep neighborhoods separated by race and ethnicity. And then also African Americans in these cities experienced really terrorist tactics by white neighborhoods to essentially keep them out. And there's a lot of evidence of this. And I'll also say, if you want to know more about this, there's a really excellent book that I take a lot of my presentation from called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It goes into great detail, really excellent book. And then also a common thing that was used in Tucson were racial covenants, where neighborhoods were built, and in the deeds of the property, it said that you could only sell property to white folks, and people of color were excluded. So this is where you start to see the framework of segregation being created. We have World War II, the Great Depression, the suburbanization and baby boom after World War II. And essentially, this creates white flight and further entrenches segregation in our country. And so during this time, the federal government creates the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, which is still what we use today, mostly to buy homes. Well, these loans were almost exclusively available to white folks. People of color were intentionally excluded. For instance, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was created in 1933, created redlining maps, which most people are familiar with, which basically said that African-American neighborhoods of color, integrated neighborhoods, were not worthy of home loans. The Federal Housing Administration in 1934 was created. And in the manual that they put out in 1938, it had racist language and basically said that we were to avoid mixing, quote, inharmonious racial or nationality groups, and that properties should only be sold to those for whom they are intended, speaking of race. From 1934 to 1962, 98% of Federal Housing Administration loans went to white folks. The GI Bill, the Veterans Administration, essentially followed suit. So again, we're talking about, the creation of the modern housing market in this country being segregated on purpose from the highest levels of government, from real estate agents on down. You also have interstate highway construction during this time that's connecting the jobs in the inner city to these newly created suburbs that, again, as I mentioned, were almost exclusively white. And I use this picture that you see here. This is I-94 that destroyed a once thriving Black neighborhood by the name of Rondo in St. Paul. Fast forward to the murder of George Floyd, and you see a group of people occupying that highway in protest. And highways, interstates in particular, are a physical barrier that has been used to separate people by race and ethnicity. Urban renewal was another thing that happened in this country. And the example in Tucson is the TCC, the convention center downtown. Much of the old barrio was destroyed. And when I moved to Tucson about 20 years ago, I learned that it was still very much a wound in Tucson that really in many ways has not been healed. In the 60s, there were race riots in over 100 cities in this country. The president at the time created the Kerner Commission to study the cause of these uprisings. And there was some very stark and blunt language. The commission's report said that riots were caused by Black frustration at lack of economic opportunity, that as a country, we're moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. Quote, white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. And quote, white institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. And it ultimately said that a fair housing law was needed. So very clear and stark language about the state of housing and race relations in this country. 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. And 6 days after his assassination, as the Capitol is surrounded by the National Guard, the Fair Housing Act is passed as the neighborhoods in protest in DC were burning. So I set that context to talk about where we are today and this idea of affirmatively furthering fair housing that the Fair Housing Act mandates. And so really here, opportunity is something that we know when we see it, right? We're talking about access to quality housing. We're talking about access to quality food, education, healthcare, all of the things that I think we all agree are things that everyone needs to thrive. And there's this great quote that we know that a child's life expectancy is predicted more by their zip code than by their genetic code. And I think what I really like about this quote is that it really solidifies or encapsulates the idea that where we live really matters. The neighborhood that we grow up in is really kind of the biggest impact on where we go in life and even how long we live. And I'll just say, if you look at different cities in this country, the life expectancy between highly concentrated neighborhoods of color versus white neighborhoods can be as large as 20 years. So it really does have a huge impact. Again, I mentioned the things that I think we can all agree create neighborhoods of opportunity, education, housing, healthcare, access to healthy food. So at the Southwest Fair Housing Council, we wanted to take a deeper dive to see how this is still showing up today in our current housing patterns. And so we use GIS mapping to create an opportunity index that uses federal data to show areas of high and low opportunity, again, looking at the areas that I mentioned: housing, transportation, access to healthcare, et cetera. And we came up with some maps, and they show areas of high and low opportunity. And so what you're looking at here is one of those maps. And this map shows overall opportunity this is the greater Tucson area. And the darker the blue is higher opportunity, and the yellow is kind of medium to low opportunity on down to the redder areas, which is lowest opportunity. And I want you to think about the context that I just described of the modern mortgage market, the modern housing market, and how that was essentially for many years only open to white folks and to the exclusion of people of color. The interstate highway system, as I mentioned, a couple of other things there. So you really see the higher opportunity areas in Tucson are the more suburban, newer areas. And again, when I moved to Tucson, I learned that people in Tucson talk about 22nd Street being kind of a physical divider between where people of color live versus the foothills and other areas where white folks live. And this map really, I'll show you, bears that out. But anyway, this opportunity index really, I think, fits within the context I was just speaking about. So then we overlay this with race and ethnicity data. And what you see here is the larger the dot in this map means the higher the percent Hispanic population. And so you can see that this map shows that where I-19 and I-10 split, the southern part of Tucson, much higher concentration of Hispanic residents. And then if you look at the bluer areas, again, the higher opportunity areas, the percentage is much, much smaller. And then just flip that around. The larger dots here show the percentage of white population, and the smaller the dot, the lower the percentage white population. So again, you see in the darker blue areas, much higher percentage white population than other areas of town. We did the map for Phoenix, so the coloration is a little bit different, but here what you see is that the lighter areas are lower opportunity areas, and the darker the area, the higher the opportunity. So again, this is just looking at opportunity. You can see there are many areas where it's very light, very low opportunity. So again, using kind of the dot feature, again, in this map, the larger the dot, the higher the percent Hispanic population. And you can see similar to Tucson and Phoenix, much higher concentrations of Hispanic residents in lower opportunity areas. And then again, flip that. Here you're seeing the concentration of white residents. The larger the dot, the higher the percentage of white residents. And again, much higher concentration of white residents in the higher opportunity areas. Again, really reflecting back the segregated housing patterns that were created in the 20th century. And then just a couple of more slides here. So again, a little bit different looking map, but again, looking at Phoenix here, the darker the red, the higher the percent Hispanic residents, and the dots are mortgage lending. And you can see essentially a dearth of mortgage lending in high concentration of Hispanic areas. The same thing for Tucson here. The darker the area, the higher the Hispanic concentration, and the dots are mortgage lending. And again, you can see in the high concentration of Hispanic area, much lower, almost non-existent mortgage lending. So what are the conclusions that I draw from this information? One, Tucson and Phoenix are still highly segregated. Hispanics are much more likely to live in low opportunity area than whites, again, reflecting this historic pattern of segregation and lack of access to opportunity. And essentially the promise of the Fair Housing Act to create integrated communities of opportunity remains unfulfilled. And we need policies to reverse really what I see as social engineering of the past that really created segregated communities that we still are living with today. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, for that excellent synopsis of the history of housing segregation. Jim Tofel, managing member of the Tofel Dent Construction, will speak next.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about affordable housing in general and the state of the affordable housing industry in Arizona and in Tucson, and just kind of give an overview of how these projects are done. A little bit more about me and what I've done is I'm also a member of the Equitable Housing Commission, along with Jay Young, and been very involved in a lot of affordable housing projects across the state. We've built roughly 25 to 30% of all the affordable housing projects in the state of Arizona. So I don't do any development, but I work very closely with developers, and I understand a lot of the issues that they deal with and challenges and how these projects are put together. So there's an overview of the affordable housing for the state of Arizona. There are currently just under 194,000 rental households that are considered extremely low income. These are households that are 60% of the area median income or less. Of those 194,000, we have a shortage of 144,000 rental homes. If you look on the bottom right graph, this shows housing cost burden by income group, and you can see as a person's income drops, the housing burden goes up proportionately. So for those who are extremely low income, 88% are cost burden, which means they spend more than 30% of their monthly income on housing. 76% are severely cost burden, which means they're spending more than 50% of their monthly income on rent and utilities. When you go to the very low income and the low income, those percentages are still high, but they get better as incomes go up. So 76% of our state's extremely low income individuals are severely cost burdened by the cost of housing. And to put this in context nationally, Arizona ranks 48th out of 50 states in terms of meeting the need of our affordable housing. So as a state, we've not done a great job of meeting that need. And Tucson is gets about 9% of the affordable housing dollars. We have about 14% of the population. So as a city, I think there's some things that we can do better to get more of those affordable housing dollars to come this direction. So just in terms of how affordable housing is built these days, 90 to 95% of all of the affordable housing units are generated through the low-income housing tax credit program. So this is a program that was developed through the 1986 Tax Reform Act, and it's a public-private partnership for developing affordable housing. Nationally, over 3 million homes have been developed under this program, which serves over 7 million households. There have been the economic development from these is pretty amazing. So there's studies that show that the tax credits given generate as much or more tax dollars through the developments, through sales tax, property tax, income tax. There's roughly 3.4 million jobs which have been created. So a typical tax credit project will create between 100 and 200 jobs. So there's a lot of economic impact from these projects, and it's by far the most successful program available. There's a lot of other programs out there that also support the low-income housing tax credit program. For example, rural development, home funds, and usually those are supplemental to the tax credits, which are the base source of financing. So there's two different types of tax credits. I'm going to just quickly talk about the two different types. So there's the 9% tax credits and the 4% tax credits. The 9% tax credits generate roughly a 70% subsidy for a project. Those are a competitive process. So there's a qualified allocation plan for the state of Arizona that has point categories, and it has to do, the point category has to do with how close is the property to transportation, like bus stations, to hospitals, to good schools, to shopping, to job centers, and then it has to also, so there's a lot of different point categories, including local contribution. And so these projects get submitted once a year. The state says these are the projects which will receive an award. These projects tend to be about 40 to 100 units in size. So the two most recent projects in Tucson that have been built under this program are the Newport at Amphi project, which is on the northwest corner of Stone and Prince, I believe. And then La Frontera just recently finished a project off of Grant. I think it's Grant and 6th Avenue. They've also, La Frontera has a couple of other projects going right now, but those are part of the 4% tax credit. So these projects target, the 9% target the very low income levels, the 40 to 80 to 60% area median incomes. The 4% tax credit is a first come, first serve. It's roughly a 40% subsidy. It targets a higher area median income level. So typically they go towards 80% area median income. And so when the rents generated on the 4% tax credit are typically, they're below market rate rents, but they're higher than the 9%. So the rent plus utilities is a maximum of 35% of the tenant's monthly income. So they keep the rents low, the tax credits help pay for the equity, and they have very low debt, and that's how the affordability works. The 4% projects tend to be larger. They're upwards of 200 apartments. I've seen projects as large as 500 apartments. on this program. And for the most part, the 4% tax credits do not get fully used. There's excess tax credits that are left over in the state each year. These projects are very difficult to get to work out financially because the subsidy is lower and the performas just don't work as well. So a couple things I just want to talk about in terms of challenges and what makes these projects difficult and looking forward is Tucson in particular, I mentioned earlier, gets 9% of the low-income housing tax credit projects, and we have 14% of the population. Tucson is a very difficult place to develop. Our median wages in Tucson are about 20% below Maricopa County, which means that those projects need to charge less for rent, and our costs are about 5 to 10% higher than the Phoenix area. And that's primarily a function of our subcontractor market down here. We got hit really hard through the 2008 housing crash, and the subcontractor community in Tucson still has not fully recovered from that. So as a result, we just do not have the capacity down here to build as much as Phoenix. And things are so busy in Phoenix right now. The Phoenix subs will still come to Tucson, but they do charge a premium to do that. These projects take a long time to develop. It typically, from the point of inception to the time where it's placed in service, can take 3 to 4 years. So that's, a developer finds a site. They say, okay, we're going to develop this affordable housing project. They go through the approval process to get the funding. They develop the plans. It gets built. That typically takes 3 to 4 years. We've had about 43% increases in our construction costs over the last 3 years. And the rents have not gone up proportionately. What's really made the situation a lot worse is what's happened with interest rates. So there is right now a large backlog of potential affordable housing projects out there that I'm not sure are going to get built because of what's happened with construction costs and what's happened with interest rates. So it's a very challenging market right now, and that's why it's so important to have attention put on this really at every level of government. It takes every level of government working together to get these projects out of the ground. That means federal, and federally they're looking at potentially different tax credit programs that can stack on the existing at the state level. And I think one of the good things about our new governor, Hobbs, is she does have a very well thought through housing plan. And she is planning on reinstating the Housing Trust Fund, which, it's basically been unfunded. They put about $3 million for the last 10 years. She's talking about making a significant investment into the Housing Trust Fund. So that's going to help. I think the other thing that's really a challenge right now is the zoning code. There are very few sites available that are zoned properly for multifamily projects, specifically for the affordable projects. And it takes 1 to 2 years to go through a zoning change. It could be upwards of $500,000 to go through a zoning change, and there's no guarantee of success. And so when a lot of developers see a site that they think would be good, but it's not zoned properly, they just take a pass and go to the next site. So I know of several developers who are looking to do projects here in Tucson, but they can't find land that will score well with the program that works at zoned properly. So there's a lot of attention being paid currently to the zoning code and trying to figure out how do we make it a little bit more flexible to get more projects in the ground. And with that, I'm going to bring it to conclusion. I think I'm a little early. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for explaining how most affordable housing is built. Tom Lewicki, the CEO of Old Pueblo Community Services, will speak next.
Okay, Thank you very much. My name's Tom Litwicki, and I serve as CEO for OPCS. I want to talk today a little bit about what's going on with homelessness as at the current moment, what some of the best known solutions are, and kind of the next steps for Tucson and Pima County. So I've been doing this enough now that there is the way it was that we were dealing with homelessness in Tucson. And the way it was essentially was that things were getting better. So from about 2013 to 2019, things were improving, and we were seeing a significant reduction in overall homelessness. The curious thing about it is that around 2017, we started to see an uptick in what's called chronic homelessness, and we started to see an increase or leveling of unsheltered homelessness. So that essentially means people who are going in and out of homelessness numerous times in a year, or persons who have severe disabilities and significant impairments, or people that are just unsheltered for the entire year. So things were getting better, but there was a bit of a concern on the horizon. The way it is now is really a crisis. So we've really entered into a stage now of critical levels of homelessness that it seems like we're at an inflection point of either putting together some very significant changes or probably becoming like a number of other larger cities in which homelessness starts reaching numbers that are almost feel insurmountable. So since 2019, you'll see in this purple line here, we do a street count once a year, and that's sort of a marker, a benchmark. It's not everyone who's homeless in the community, but it's a consistent benchmark each year. And what we've found is that right around 2019, we started seeing a big jump in our street count. And we started seeing a big jump in our unsheltered and chronic homelessness. So chronic homelessness started really shooting up. So there's probably a lot of reasons for that. One is the pandemic. The other is rental costs. There are issues with, as Jim had mentioned, the inventory of affordable housing in Tucson. On average, you can assume that there's about 10,000 households that experience homeless each year in our county. And right now, the best estimate through the University Southwest Institute for Research on Women is that about 4,000 people are unsheltered throughout the year. The other thing that really has dramatically increased and is very problematic is the number of deaths by persons who are homeless. So the Pima County Office of Medical Examiner tracks how many individuals are dying in an unsheltered homeless state. And you can see in 2020, it was 157, 2021, it was 193. So we're starting to see it's been an increase, and it's starting to get much higher. Along with that, I think when you look at the whole story, it becomes this question of cost and what this is costing us to kind of stay in the same position. So the USICH, which is an interagency council of about 19 federal agencies that tracks and makes recommendations, policy recommendations about homelessness, says that about $30,000 to $50,000 per year is the cost of homelessness. So if we have 4,000 people and we just took the 30,000 a year, that would have a cost to our community of around 120 million. Now that might be too high, so we could even get a little more conservative and say, let's just look at the 854, and the 854 would just get you at around 25 million. Now these are costs of fire, police, emergency rooms, and other situations in which people are using emergency services that then become a cost to the community. There's a really, really big paradigm shift that we're always talking about when we talk about homelessness, and that is this idea of ending chronic and unsheltered homelessness. So I want to talk a little bit about this concept and how we look at this. So there's something called, a lot of times you'll speak with homeless providers and they'll talk about unsheltered homelessness and being able to end homelessness. they talk about something called a functional zero. So functional zero is a way that USICH has come up with throughout in their federal plans to measure the degree of homelessness in the community. So it basically is a method in which communities track by name lists of people who are unsheltered through counts and screenings and assessments throughout the year, which we do in Pima County. And you can then see a list of people who are coming into homelessness and the people who are coming out of homelessness. When the number of people who are leaving homelessness is greater than the number of people coming into homelessness in a 30-day period, you've essentially hit this functional zero, which is the goal of the system. So what it basically says is that people generally do not remain in homelessness past than 30 days. So you'll often hear a phrase called homelessness is rare and brief. So when people come into homelessness, they're quickly moved out of homelessness, and you don't see this unsheltered encampment population throughout a community that we're starting to really experience a growth in Tucson. So there have some people, been some communities that have reached this functional zero. Communities that, as I've gone out and studied and looked at communities that have reached this, there's or come close to that and really significantly reduced homelessness. There's some certain ingredients or qualities that we see across the board. They may take different approaches or methods, but they all have these qualities in my observation. The first is that they adopt some evidence-based approaches. There's a lot of different ways of addressing homelessness, and homelessness has often been left to many, many different nonprofits and charities. And they've often gone in different ways. It may fit their belief systems or their religious structures. And this basically says, hey, we need to look at this. There's evidence, there's science, and as a community, we need to agree that we're going to invest in approaches that have been demonstrated to actually work. The real challenge of that is you start disinvesting in things that don't work. And that's where things can get a little dicey in the community, because people have personal and professional investment in models sometimes that don't actually work very well. The other one is there's a coordination of housing and services. Many nonprofit organizations and government entities are involved in homelessness, and they're often going in lots of different directions at the same time. So every community that's done this has put together some structure of coordinating all of this activity. The other one that's a big one is somewhere along the line, the communities adopted a strategic plan that has real homeless count benchmarks. A lot of plans will have, we're going to increase affordable housing by 100 units, but there's no measures or benchmarks within the plan usually that involve, when we do the street count next year, we're going to count 100 less people, or 200 less people, or 10 less people, something that will actually show a measurable progress to reducing homelessness within the community. The next one, which is a big one, of course, is finding a way to increase the inventory of housing that is affordable to homeless households. So that's that very low income community. A lot of the folks that we work with at OPCS have zero income to extremely minimal income. So how do we have housing that reaches and fits for those folks so that they can stay stable and not be evicted? And then transitioning from shelter and permanent housing to a treatment first, or housing from treatment first to a housing first model. So how do we turn this around so that we are doing less shelter and more housing? And so you're reducing the cost of shelter and you're increasing revenue to housing. I've seen communities do this in, like I say, in different ways, coordination between government agencies. There have been communities that have taken homelessness as an emergency and put it to local emergency authorities to address homelessness. There's lots of different ways to do it, but they tend to have these 5 ingredients. I want to speak briefly about this notion of treatment first versus housing first. Has become a bigger and bigger issue in our community. Simply put, treatment first is the standard sort of model for addressing homelessness. It had the assumption, which makes sense, that people would move into some emergency shelter, and then once they really got their life together, they could go to a transitional housing. And if they followed all the rules there and did what they were supposed to do, then they would move into permanent housing. This worked well for folks who had a limited amount of impairment to things like a serious mental illness, physical disabilities, addiction. But if they had a lot of those problems, they typically might make it to the transitional housing point, and then they would end up getting kicked out for some reason. And they'd cycle in and out of shelter and transitional housing at a high cost to the system and not any actual improvement. That's why later, after 30, 40 years of this, we end up with a concentration of persons who are unsheltered, who have a high degree of mental illness and addictions because they haven't succeeded or the system wasn't designed for them to be successful. Housing first is this radical notion that you first get people permanent housing and then you work on all these other items. A lot of discourse in our community is that maybe housing first doesn't involve treatment. However, the housing first model has a significant amount of medical, mental health, behavioral, income, employment services, landlord relationships. So it isn't about just putting people into housing and then saying good luck. It's about helping people get into housing so they have that stability to then build for the rest of their life. Essentially, people don't typically improve on these higher level concerns if they're uncertain where they're going to sleep or if they're going to live for the next week. There's no sense working on these other things. So that's kind of how it works. Along with that, I want to mention the other two that really fall into place a lot, and that is the housing first, or the harm reduction and trauma-informed care. So housing first, you'll hear a lot that it's about managing chronic homelessness to solving chronic homelessness, which is sort of what I just provided in the previous slide. I've already done that. So what's the evidence? I'm going to mention just a brief few of these. I've included all these slides in the material if you want to get deeper into the evidence. But essentially, housing first has been studied for the last 30 years. The VA has adopted housing first because they found that it had a 54% reduction in inpatient program use, 30% reduction in outpatient, while increasing the number of people going to housing. So it's increased into housing and decrease the cost. Same thing, you'll find it internationally through Canada. There's been numerous studies. This one involved 2,000 participants. And again, increases when you compare it to treatment first approaches, increase in housing outcomes and cost. There are a number of communities that have done this. So I provided this slide not to go over every piece of it, but just to give you a sense of a lot of communities that have hit this functional zero for veteran homelessness and quite a bit on the chronic homeless side. This is Utah. If you want to look at housing ending chronic housing, you will see that Utah has made some great progress. Local outcomes, again, very briefly, when you look at housing first and treatment first, this is a project that was done in Tucson. You'll see about 44% or 21% from treatment first moving into housing versus 69% of housing first. And you'll see a much longer time people are in permanent housing. So when you look at this for about 100 people in these two models, you'll see about 12 people versus 52 people actually moving into and staying for the long-term and permanent housing. This is a cost slide. I'll let you look at that in your leisure. Next steps for our community. Jay had mentioned and Jim had mentioned a lot of the different things that are happening. Really, it's that coordinated strategic plan about how do we bring all of these entities together to work together with real benchmarks. What can people do? I won't go over all of this, but essentially it's about making a personal paradigm shift and advocating for that comprehensive plan with government leadership. That leadership has to come from the government. That's critical. And then you as an individual, using your resources towards those that are. So what does OPCS do? I won't go over everything we do, but we basically go from street outreach, everything's low barrier, and all the way to permanent supportive housing. The next thing for us is this Center for Housing First, which will be at Park and 33rd, I believe, the end corner there used to be the Urban League. And it's really a center about coordinating, planning, and bringing evidence-based practices to scale. So if you look at that in the community, it'll be what you can find out there. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was a very informative overview of the ingredients that lead to functional zero and of the housing first concept. Gerald Williams, who has experienced homelessness, will now speak.
Thank you for having me. My availability and reason why I'm here on the panel is because I am an individual that has experienced homelessness here in Pima County. My stint with homelessness came in the end of 2016 or the beginning of 2017. I was just fortunate enough to still own a vehicle at the time that I wasn't living and sleeping on the street. I was living in my vehicle. And during that time, I would, the parks, you're supposed to be out of the parks at 10:30. So there was one particular park on Stella in between Man and Cole that I would park my vehicle and sleep in the vehicle overnight. And I had noticed another family that was doing the same thing. During that time, I would wake up and I had several friends that I can go to their house and shower before I went to work. But I saw that family at that particular time using the bathroom in the morning to use to bird bath, I would say. And with that, that humbled me to a point to really understand, what people are going through. As a formerly incarcerated individual, my homelessness didn't come by way of me coming home from prison. It was due to my divorce and separation from my family. And at the time I was working and trying to access several of the housing assistance agencies, but I was over the threshold of the amount of income to be able to get into a program. So that kept me out of programs that would help me get into affordable housing, trying to navigate still paying bills and child support and being a hands-on father. It really threw me because, I was in need, but I understood that I was over the allowed amount of income to be able to get into the program, but I still didn't make enough to be able to afford a one-bedroom apartment and utilities and all the other bills that I had. It is imperative that we continue to look to assist and build more affordable housing here in Pima County with the inflation and things of that nature going on around the country. And jobs are not raising our wage to be able to combat the things that are going on with gas and food going up and the rent costs going up. I think that will soon be causing more homelessness for the middle class families because renters and corporations are raising the rent at a yearly clip. And it's not affordable for those that are single parents or even families that are below the $50,000 a year mark of income. We also have individuals that are returning home from prison. And we're here in Arizona are one of the still remaining states that spend over $1.5 billion a year to incarcerate individuals instead of getting them treatment and setting them up for success. Those individuals will be returning home and they need a place to stay. And also, being a formerly incarcerated individual, we still live with that stigma on our head, and we are sometimes denied places to stay. Not sometimes, 9 times out of 10, we are denied places to stay because of that past incarceration on our record. And here in Tucson, they tend to push us to a certain community. We're only those apartments or those corporations would rent to us. And 9 times out of 10, those sometimes are always taken because that is the most affordable places that individuals can find apartments. It is hard to try to better oneself when you are released from prison. Then you're really forced back into a neighborhood or surrounding where you're trying to really get away from. Those neighborhoods are, the high crime areas where you see a lot of the drug use being done, and a lot of mental health problems of those that are homeless on the streets. They tend to flock together in homeless camp and things of that nature. I do a lot of work. What I do, not only with Emerge and with the HEAT program, I also work with Justice Services and trying to get individuals that are released from jail into services that will help them get employment and help them get from transitional housing to permanent housing. With being a peer, I think a peer is someone that, to me, that peer certification is like not a GED, but a PhD. It is something that is very, very valuable right now to get others to buy into just the justice reform that is going on around the country. We are used in a lot of different areas. It took a while for me to really buy into what was going on with the MacArthur Foundation and the Safety and Justice Challenge, and trying to use our jails in a better and a strategic way, trying to help grassroots organizations to be able to assist families and individuals that are dealing with homelessness and mental health issues on a local level. I was just one of the ones, by the grace of God, that was able to use my experience and my expertise in all of these areas. Coming from prison, I was just blessed by the grace of God to be able to understand and overcome a lot of the barriers that one faces when you come home, trying to navigate getting your ID and health access, and just trying to find a job, and really understanding that there's a lot of hard work that it takes to overcome all of these barriers. I work with the NAACP and on the criminal justice board, and with the IMA, I'm on the criminal justice domain. I'm a co-chair for the criminal justice domain as well. And understanding and navigating the system and the things that I've experienced has helped me to be able to help those that are going through the same thing that I faced. Right now, I had a few individuals that were living in OPCS homes. And as he stated, they have a very good transitional living process. But we need a lot of individuals that may be persons with lived experience to be able to help in those areas to keep people on track. I think we lose a lot of people through the gap because of the still chronic mental illness and drug use at the time. And having people that look like them. My plus is, I'm an African-American male, and I try to really, really go to bat for my community and to show those that are still going through what I went through, that it can be done. I'm just blessed and fortunate to be able to continue to share my experiences from not only the adult point of view, but I also work with youth. I have a son that has mental health issues, and trying to help him navigate the world, going through high school and just being a normal individual is a task in itself. Our system, we need so many different forms of housing, from the form of group homes to transitional living homes to assisted living homes to medical assisted living homes, to be able to assist families that are facing all type of barriers when it comes to dealing with individuals of that space. Now that we are moving towards the direction of building more affordable housing, I think that it is imperative that we continue to also look in all of those areas as far as being able to help the youth. They are using models. We have a lady here with her youth program, she's using the model of those tiny homes and getting individuals the access to be able to just, see what it is to be able to be a homeowner at an early age. There are several different things I think that we can attack and ways that we can, combat the homelessness here in Tucson with those tiny home developments. But as it was stated, when we develop things, we have to have it zoned properly to be on a bus line, to have, stores and access to schools and things of that nature. We are on a good road. I think that it just takes a lot of us to work together and not in silos, doing things on a grand scale to be able to combat all of the things that we see with homelessness now here in Tucson. Again, we have to have homes or some type of transitional living for those that are making their transition home from prison. They are not forgotten, and we have to be able to embrace them when they come to their point of release. And as I stated, it is to be able to just be accepted in the community, not for one, but then when you don't have family and if you're not from here, those obstacles of trying to find a home or an apartment to stay are very, very great for one that is coming home from prison. So, just making things accessible so we won't force people into poverty and homelessness would be another good area to attack so that people are welcomed and feel that, they're not damned to poverty or just thrown away because of their past experiences or what they went through. Being able to continue to partner with not only Housing First, but other developers that will be coming here to Pima County to help combat our homeless situation is a plus. The red line, it is now inverted because the gentrification. Those that were living in the foothills are now trying to come into the inner city because they see the value of the inner city. So we as African Americans have had it, pretty bad on each side. And now with the gentrification, we're being forced out into the suburbs where, the cost of living is much higher, where families will have to travel, to and fro, and the price of gas is higher. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I thank you all for joining me. And we would love to continue to work towards combating this homelessness on all levels for youth and adults here in the county. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald, for sharing your story. It is now time for questions, and I'm going to read aloud the questions that have been submitted, and then the panel will respond. The first question is, does a subsidized housing model based on a percentage of income act as a counter incentive for people to improve their situation? Do they risk losing their housing if they improve their income? Gerald, I'm going to ask you, because you actually mentioned that you were not eligible for housing because your income was too high. I'm going to ask you to perhaps respond to that first, and then I'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
Well, I don't know how it is now, but I know back in 2016 and 17, I was, like I said, over the mark of the allowed income to be able to get into a program. And at that time, I didn't really think I was making that much money to be able to say that I didn't qualify. So now I can tell you what the economy or the benchmark for income to be able to get into a housing program or to even be selected for Section 8. Those are things that I think keep people from out of the affordable housing pocket because of what the amount of money they're making, but they're not making less enough to be able to be in the program. You know, it with food and utilities and things of that nature, all that plays a part. So right now, I couldn't tell you the exact number that you need to be under to be able to get into a program, but I do know that that plays a part.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering, Jim, do you have any perspective on?
Yeah, so thank you. You know, when I think about affordable housing, I don't look at it as a handout. It's really giving people a step up to have a place that is sustainable, safe,
People.
and
There you go.
what's that?
Did you have any perspective you wanted to add to the question? Would you like me to?
Yeah. So,
Okay.
so I guess what I'm trying to say is that's a success story. If somebody is in a situation where they can make enough income to where they don't qualify, that is a success story. It's not a black or white thing anymore. A couple of years ago, they did pass a ordinance nationally about income averaging. So if somebody is over by like $1,000, they're not going to lose their home. I mean, if they're significantly over, then that's going to create an issue for the owner, because they do have to maintain a certain level of area median income for the tenants. But it's not a black or white thing, and I don't know how often it happens, but I do know that income averaging has helped that situation.
Okay, all right, thank you. We'll go to the next question, but before we do, I wanted to remind the audience that if you have a question that you want to add, if you're participating via Zoom, you can write your questions in the Q&A section, which is usually located at the bottom of your screen. And if your question is intended for a specific panelist, please indicate that. And if you're watching on Facebook, I remind you that Facebook does not provide an interactive option to ask questions, but hopefully your question will be asked by somebody else and you will hear it answered. So next question is, the hundreds of people I see each day appear to have addiction and mental health issues. Who's researching the root causes of this group and seeing solutions? Seems to be a very large group ignored in these conversations. I'm going to ask Tom to start with that one, because I think you did mention it in your presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. The other thing I'll mention is that the previous question on income, the most common vouchers that we use are called housing choice vouchers, which we're very supportive of. That means the person, in theory, if they can find a place that fits the rental rates, can live where they want in the area they want. It's supposed to be very portable. It isn't stuck to a specific property, but it goes with them throughout their life. The other thing is that as income goes up, then their portion goes up and the voucher goes down. And what happens with our folks that we're working with, typically at some point their income goes up enough that they don't need the voucher, and then we move the voucher to another person. So I think that the housing choice voucher system for housing is a pretty great way to do housing. The other one, when you talk about mental health and illness, and we talk about addressing needs, yeah, that's primarily our work. There isn't enough money, essentially. I mean, part of the problem is money. There isn't enough money. So if we have a third or a fourth of the resources we need to address all of the people who are homeless, then we focus on those who have the very highest need and are the most likely to perish in the next 12 months if they don't get out of homelessness. So that means there's a whole group of people out there who are not getting help because there just isn't enough money. We don't have enough. There's 4,000 people unsheltered. We have about 150 beds. So we're triaging and prioritizing those who have the highest need. And I mentioned that because a lot of times people will say, well, someone is homeless in our area and they have really high needs. But in comparison, when we triage, we have folks who are literally, in the process of perishing in their homeless state because of their physical chronic health conditions, coupled with mental illness and addictions. And so the prioritization and the triage is quite high, kind of like an emergency room. There are a number of places dealing with that. I don't think there's enough with that. There are people who, and this is not most people are homeless, but the people we're working with have these conditions. But there are people that you and I see every day, probably on our way to work or somewhere else, who we can tell is severely mentally ill, probably in a psychotic state, and are homeless on the streets. And they all have Medicaid and access, and we go out and work with them. But every agency and their primary health agency should be out there working with them on a daily basis. There should be such more intensity working with these folks. What happens is people go out and say, well, do you want homeless housing? And they say, no, go away. And then they say, well, I offered it, but they didn't want it. Well, they didn't want it because they're severely mentally ill, and it's going to take years of working with them. We've abandoned them for 20 years. It's going to take years to help them get into housing, and a lot of money. Fact of the matter is, it's just a lot of money.
Okay, thank you. The next question, is there anything that can be done if police dismiss racial discrimination and harassment and even elder abuse at my condo? I think that's probably a Jay question, at least.
Well, every situation is different, obviously, and at the Southwest Fair Housing Council, that is precisely what we do. So, if somebody is facing a housing situation and they think that they may have experienced illegal housing discrimination under the Fair Housing Act, we work to understand what they have experienced and help them understand what their rights are, what their landlords or HOA or whatever responsibilities are as well. So, without knowing specifics of this particular situation, it's hard to say, but obviously everyone has fair housing rights, and there are ways to exercise those rights. So I know that's a vague answer, but for a specific question like that, it certainly depends generally on specific facts. So I guess I would invite the person to contact the Southwest Fair Housing Council for more assistance.
Okay. So for Jim, question about what would the Housing Trust Fund do, the one mentioned in your presentation?
Thank you. So the Housing Trust Fund is there's different levels of housing trust funds. So the City of Tucson has a housing trust fund. The state also does, and it basically provides a supplemental source of financing to meet project gaps. So the example I gave about what's happening right now with inflation, what that's done is that's created a gap on a lot of projects, and the gap might be, $1 million, it might be $3 million. But the Housing Trust Fund is a source of supplementary financing that can help close that gap to get these projects across the finish line so they can start construction and get built.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about Section 8 housing. Is that the same as the housing choice option? And I'm going to open this up. So is there one of the panel that would like to respond to that?
So I think happy to provide some response. In general, Section 8 housing choice vouchers are the same thing. What happens is a housing authority, which in our community is the City of Tucson, is the public housing authority, gets these vouchers funded through HUD or some other means, federal means. And some of them are targeted to families that are homeless, and then some are targeted to families that meet the requirement based on income. They may be doubled up. They're already in an apartment, but as Jim was saying, they're really highly burdened by the cost of rent, and so they're eligible for this voucher assistance based on a percent of their income and the cost of the rent. The difference is that Section 8 vouchers are not connected to folks who are necessarily homeless, and so it's a different application and process system. And then there are some Section 8 vouchers which are called often referred to as site-based vouchers. So that might be where someone develops a property or rehabilitates a property, and with that property, the housing authority says, we will give you, 40 vouchers. That could be all of the units in that property. It could be some. And then what happens is someone may qualify for that, and they go into that unit. And if they ever leave that unit, the voucher stays with the unit. So if they get to a point where they make higher income, that's where they may need to actually move away from there at some point, and then someone else takes that unit who has a lower income. So some are portable and some are not, depending on how it's done. And they're all essentially become based on the percent of your income. So as your income increases, the payment for the voucher decreases. Hope that's clear.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question. We are about to experience an enormous unprecedented demographic shift with the US and the world. Tucson and Arizona will be even more extreme. Ollie UA and the Department of Psychology at the UA have a free webinar Monday about this issue. Okay. There is going to be even more strain as many of those aging are living on the edge, lack retirement savings, etc. It would seem we are at the tip of the iceberg or the real issues coming. I think the question is basically about homelessness and the older population. Is there anyone on the panel that would like to talk about that? I think, Jim, you mentioned in your bio that your company does build senior housing. Is that intended for low-income individuals?
Well, yeah, there's no question that with the baby boomers reaching retirement age, that senior housing is becoming a higher priority. I would say probably a third of the projects that I look at right now are age restricted, and the way that the affordable housing programs work is they define that as ages 55 and up. So I'm seeing a lot of it. I'm not exactly. I understand the question, but I'm not sure what the answer is.
Okay, all right. Do any of the other panelists have something they want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. We see this all the time with the folks that call us at Southwest Fair Housing Council, where, older folks are living on a fixed income, and particularly over the last several years, as rents have increased, people just can't keep up with the rent and are faced with a situation where, they've been living somewhere for 10, 15, 20 years, they're in their 70s or 80s, and all of a sudden, they're faced with trying to move and all that entails, and to actually find a place that they can afford. And, it just goes back to the crisis that we're in of affordable housing. And, I think Jim and I at least have talked about this quite a bit of, when you allow the market to be the thing that's dictating what housing is getting built, you end up having a lack of affordable housing. And without more funding, like Tom was talking about, and Jim as well, without more funding, really, in my opinion, from the federal government or the state government, we're just going to continue to be in this housing crisis. I think this is kind of what we get when the market is allowed to fully dictate. So, I think that obviously housing is very complex, but I think one of the things that is very clear is that if we're going to solve this issue, there are things that obviously we can do like we do on the Commission for Equitable Housing and Development, we've recommended a number of things that the City of Tucson can do to help make it more feasible to build affordable housing. But that's really just around the edges. Really, we need more funding, more action from, in my opinion, the government level to address these issues, because again, in my opinion, the private market just doesn't do it. So, until we get serious at looking at real solutions from that level, I think we're going to continue to be in this situation. And in this particular question about, housing for older folks is just kind of one piece of that puzzle.
Okay. We have a question about, what do you think of tiny homes rather than Section 8 housing? It's not directed to a particular panelist. I know Gerald mentioned tiny homes.
I can add just a little something about tiny homes. I do believe I'm a very strong champion of tiny homes. I think they're very affordable versus Section 8. Section 8, you can that voucher will go to a 1-bedroom apartment to a 3-bedroom home. But when you position tiny homes and really set them up in a place in a neighborhood to where they're accessible and affordable for everyone, I think those are a great way to be able to deal with a lot of the homelessness and the overpricing of homes and apartments that can help with not only the homeless for youth and adults, but the senior living. But when you deal with the senior living in tiny homes, you have to make it wheelchair accessible and things of that nature. But those are being used all around the country. Not only tiny homes, but the storage containers and turning those into homes as well. Those are very affordable to be able to renovate, and just trying to find the proper neighborhood and zoning to be able to build. That's one of the keys that not only, we were talking about that in the Fort Tucson not too long ago. There's a developer that's trying to build those homes. I think he said he can build one unit for less than $40,000, I think it was. And just being able to do that is a problem. I think the landowners and the City of Tucson need to come together to not bleed the developers and the construction dry. It's just being understanding to the economy and what a person can afford. And that tiny home model, they have several different models. They have models that are going up that you can move and are ran off of solar panels. Then they have the tiny homes that are stationed on concrete slabs. So there are very variations that we can play with to be able to accommodate the need in that area or for that particular population. Especially when it comes to those that are drug addicted or dealing with severe mental health issues. They have some that are very, very sturdy, but they're not cost effective. And those that are in that population that are in and out, people that are on access, I think would love to call that home instead of a park bench or a wash or things of that nature. I really, really think that we have the room to be able to put tiny homes in effective spots throughout Pima County, one on the north side, one on the south side, one on the east side, one on the west side, and build out from there. Like I say, you can make those affordable and accessible, wheelchair accessible, and things of that nature. That's how I feel about the tiny home situation.
Okay. Thank you. And Tom, you have your hand up. You wanted to add something?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the interesting thing about innovative housing approaches is the idea that maybe it's a stepping stone from the current situation we're in, because if we really want to get somewhere, we need to talk about adding like 4,000 units to the community. And when we start talking about typical processes of bringing housing online, That's probably not going to happen real quick. So what's the interim? And maybe things like tiny homes are a good interim. One of the challenges I think that I always have with these innovative solutions is if there isn't really a path out, and if it's long term and it's tied towards people who are homeless with disabilities and addictions, we start then moving into something of a segregated model. And what usually happens is then the entity starts talking about, well, we should have a doctor there. So now we have a doctor for homeless people. We should have a dentist. We should have this. We should have that. And we're basically going right back to, I think, in a sense, what Jay mentioned in our history, which is we're moving back into a segregated model. We're basically saying communities like the homeless community, which has a higher percentage of color than the general population, is now being kind of shuffled into this, specific area. And they're usually, if the neighborhood is going to agree, or the area, they're going to probably be in areas that are not a great high opportunity for schools and employment and education and medical services. So I think when you go down the full path, it may be a nice interim and may be needed at the point we're at, the crisis we're at. But for me, it's always about what's the path out of that and recognizing that's a short term. On the other hand, these innovative housing solutions also are perfect for people who are just making less money or are, say, retired or and don't have a high income and just don't want to spend that much money on their housing. So I think the other thing is to look at these options of innovative housing solutions for the community at large. That way you're not creating, concentrations of problems and poverty. Some of the plans I've heard start talking about building walls around these properties, and it starts getting a little draconian. It starts sounding, it could get out of hand pretty quickly. So for me, I have to always come back to this: is this segregation, and how do we make sure that we're integrating people with mental illness, addictions, and other problems into the community and not segregating them?
Okay, thank you. We have a question for Jay. What are some policy change possibilities being considered to help reverse social engineering damage from the past?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that is actually happening right now is the current administration, the Biden administration in Washington, is going through a rulemaking process to make it more clear what jurisdictions' obligations are to actually affirmatively further fair housing, reduce segregated housing patterns, create more integrated living patterns, all the things that I was discussing. So one of the things that's been problematic over the years is that though this has been part of the Fair Housing Act since it was passed in 1968, there's not been much guidance from the federal government, nor has there been much enforcement for jurisdictions to actually wrestle with how to address this issue. And I think, obviously, looking at how the situation was created, it was the full force of the federal government. It was realtors. It was really the whole housing industry that created this. So, it's not going to be a simple fix, but it's going to take the effort of all of these different sectors. One, recognizing that this is still an issue in the legacy that we deal with, and then I think it's really going to take concerted effort on the local level. And I think that's a big key to this movement and to this issue, is that local jurisdictions getting together, talking to people in the community, and coming up with longer term plans to address the issue, because it is complex. And having taken so many years to entrench it in our housing market and in our housing patterns, it's going to take a long time, I think, an effort to really undo it.
Thank you. We have a question. Does Jim know of any focus on intergenerational housing with developers? With the rapid aging of society, the lack of affordability of housing for young people, it seems logical that we are going to see a need for such shared accommodations to keep people from slipping into homelessness.
Yeah, thank you. So that was one of the driving arguments for the ADU ordinance, which is the additional dwelling unit ordinance, which was recently passed by the City of Tucson. And as they stated, this is becoming a much more common issue because of all the housing affordability problems out there right now. It's really pushing a lot of families in this direction where it would be either the younger generation or the older retiring generation. They want to keep them at home, but maybe in a separate dwelling unit. And so I think that was a really positive thing that the city of Tucson did. I know Phoenix and some of the other cities in the state are looking at that as a model for their cities as well. That's the only thing I've really seen that addresses that, but I do know that is becoming a bigger problem.
Okay, we are at our conclusion, and I would just like to thank our panelists, Jay Young, Jim Tofel, Tom Lewicki, and Gerald Williams, and the NAACP Tucson branch for co-sponsoring this event. A recording of today's panel discussion will be available on the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson YouTube channel. And I know some of those slides went by kind of quick, so if you want to spend more time, look for the recording. Mark your calendars for the Medical Aid in Dying Zoom presentation this Tuesday, February 21st at 6 p.m. and our 10th annual Issues and Eggs Zoom webinar on Friday, March 3rd. Dr. Meeks is going to be one of the panelists at Issues and Eggs. You can register for both at lwvtucson.org. And thank you.